I never thought building a simple fence would turn my quiet suburban life into a battlefield. But when Abigail, the self-appointed queen of our neighborhood, decided I was her next target, things spiraled into chaos fast. She filed complaint after complaint, stalked my property, and even tried to drag the police into her war. But the moment that still makes my blood run cold, the night I overheard her through the cedar boards of my brand new fence telling someone on the phone, "Phase 1 didn't work. Time for Phase 2. At first, I thought it was just another empty threat from a bitter neighbor. But then, she called 911, her voice trembling as she accused me of threatening to eliminate her permanently if she didn't move away. In that split second, I realized this wasn't just harassment anymore. It was a calculated plan to destroy me. What Abigail didn't know, though, was that I'd been documenting everything, and the very tools she tried to use against me were about to become the weapons that ended her reign of terror for good. When I first moved into this neighborhood, I imagined peace, quiet evenings, and friendly faces. A perfect suburban dream. And for a while, that's exactly what it was. Kids played on the sidewalks, neighbors waved from their porches, and weekends were filled with cookouts and laughter. But every community has that one person. Ours was Abigail. She wasn't officially the HOA president, at least not yet. But she acted like she owned every square inch of the neighborhood. In her mid-30s, always in flashy over-the-top clothes, her presence was impossible to ignore, and so was her temper. Abigail had a reputation. She didn't just enforce rules, she invented them on the spot. If your grass grew a little too long, she was there, snapping pictures. Leave your trash bins out a few minutes late? She'd already emailed the board, and heaven forbid you make any improvement to your home without her blessing. At first, I brushed it off. Some people just need control to feel important. But Abigail's obsession with my property quickly crossed the line from annoying to unsettling. It started small. Passive-aggressive notes left on my door, reminders about HOA policies that didn't even exist. But soon, she was sitting in her car across from my driveway, watching. Every time I stepped outside, I could feel her eyes following me. I tried reasoning with her and even joked about how seriously she took her self-appointed job. She didn't laugh. Instead, her face hardened, and she leaned in close, her words sharp. Rules are rules, and if you don't follow them, you'll regret it. That was the moment I realized. This wasn't about rules. This was about power, and Abigail wasn't going to stop until she got what she wanted. What I didn't know yet was just how far she'd go to break me. When I first bought my home, I thought I was stepping into a dream. A quiet cul-de-sac, neatly trimmed lawns, and neighbors who waved when they walked their dogs. The kind of community where you could actually leave your garage open for a few minutes and not worry about anything disappearing. For the first few weeks, it felt perfect. Kids rode their bikes in the evenings, families had weekend barbecues, and the HOA mostly kept things tidy without being overbearing. I thought I'd found a place where I could finally settle down. But every paradise has its serpent, and ours was Abigail. She wasn't technically the HOA president yet, but everyone in the neighborhood knew she was gunning for it. Abigail was the kind of person you noticed even if you tried not to. Mid to late 30s, always dressed like she was headed to a party no one else was invited to. Bright neon blouses, sequined skirts, and flashy jewelry that caught the sunlight like a warning sign. She didn't blend in. She didn't want to. And her personality matched her wardrobe, loud, brash, and impossible to ignore. At first, I tried to be friendly. I introduced myself and even complimented her on how involved she seemed with the community. She smiled, but not the warm kind of smile you expect from a neighbor. It was the tight, practiced grin of someone already planning their next move. It didn't take long to see how much power she thought she had. If a neighbor's grass grew a half-inch too tall, Abigail had pictures of it before noon. If someone's trash bins lingered on the curb for an hour past collection, she sent friendly reminders with timestamps. She even knocked on doors to scold families for holiday decorations that didn't fit the HOA aesthetic. It was laughable at first. A petty little tyrant desperate to feel important. But then she noticed me. The first time was over something small. I had parked my car just a little off-center in my own driveway. Abigail tapped on my door, clipboard in hand, and informed me that my parking habits were an eyesore. I chuckled, thinking she was joking. She wasn't. A few days later, I found a note taped to my door. Friendly reminder, HOA vehicles must be parked neatly and in accordance with neighborhood standards. Please comply immediately. Except, there was no such rule. The more I ignored her, the worse it got. She began circling my property like a hawk, sitting in her car, engine, running, phone in hand, watching. I'd catch her jotting things down every time I so much as took the trash out. One evening, I caught her snapping pictures of my backyard from the sidewalk. When I confronted her, she crossed her arms, her lips curled into a smug smirk, and said, "If you've got nothing to hide, you won't mind a little documentation." That's when the line between annoying neighbor and stalker started to blur. I tried to reason with her. I told her I wanted peace, that I wasn't interested in any HOA politics or power games. She leaned in close, her perfume so strong it nearly choked me, and hissed, "Rules are rules, and if you don't follow them, you'll regret it." Those words stuck with me, not because of what she said, but how she said it, like she already had a plan in motion. The next few weeks were torture. Every time I mowed my lawn, she was there, arms crossed, watching. Every time I brought groceries inside, I'd hear her, camera click. She started whispering to other neighbors when I walked by, pointing, smirking, and making me out to be some kind of criminal. Then came the complaints. The HOA board started sending me letters, noise violations, improper use of my property, and even accusations that I was running a business from my garage. None of it was true, but each letter carried threats of fines. And I knew exactly where they were coming from. Abigail's fingerprints were all over them. The final straw was the day I found her on my property line, measuring tape in hand. She claimed my fence was encroaching on community land, even though my deed clearly proved otherwise. When I told her to leave, she laughed, muttered something about getting the authorities involved, and strutted off like she'd already won. That night, for the first time since moving in, I couldn't sleep, because deep down, I knew this wasn't going to end with a few complaints. Abigail wasn't just enforcing rules, she was rewriting them, twisting them, and weaponizing them, and I was her new target. What I didn't realize then was just how far she was willing to go to break me. The weeks that followed were nothing short of a nightmare, and it felt like Abigail had made it her personal mission to dismantle every shred of peace I had left, starting with a barrage of notices that arrived in my mailbox like clockwork. First, a fine for my grass supposedly being too long, even though I had mowed it 2 days earlier. Then a violation because my trash cans were left out for 45 minutes after pickup, when in reality I was at work and couldn't physically drag them in any sooner, and soon after that, a citation for unsightly garden arrangements. Because I had dared to plant a row of sunflowers along the side of my house. Each letter was colder than the last, dressed in the official HOA letterhead, dripping with legal jargon designed to intimidate. But I knew exactly who was behind them, because I'd see Abigail smirking from across the street every time I bent down to collect the mail, and the way she stood there with her arms folded, her gaudy jewelry catching the sun like warning beacons. It was obvious she was savoring my frustration, but things escalated quickly beyond fines and passive-aggressive notes. Suddenly, there were new rules being circulated in the community newsletter, restrictions that suspiciously aligned with things I owned or did, like the sudden ban on excessive exterior lighting right after I installed motion sensor, lights for security, or the newly drafted guideline about vehicles of commercial nature being prohibited in driveways just days after my friend, who drives a company-branded van, had visited me for dinner, and every single so-called rule came with the threat of penalties that grew larger with each passing week, the fines stacking up faster than I could dispute them, until I was supposedly owing the HOA hundreds, then thousands of dollars. And all the while Abigail paraded around like a queen bee, gossiping to neighbors, stirring paranoia, convincing some that I was the problem homeowner, bringing the whole community down, while others simply stayed silent out of fear of becoming her next target. And if the fines weren't enough, the interference in my daily life grew unbearable. She started photographing guests who visited my house, documenting the plates of delivery drivers, even accusing me in an official complaint of operating an unlicensed business simply because a handyman came by twice in the same week to fix a leak and then help with my fence. And though I submitted proof after proof that the claims were baseless, the HOA board, conveniently swayed by Abigail's relentless campaigning and manipulative charm, turned a blind eye, or worse, nodded along as if her word was gospel, and every letter, every meeting, every warning came with that same unshakable undertone. "We're coming for you." And the deeper I dug, the more sinister it became. Because I discovered that many of the rules being enforced weren't even legally binding. They were invented, twisted interpretations of vague HOA bylaws that Abigail used like weapons, and while part of me wanted to laugh at the absurdity of it, like being told I needed permission slips to repaint my shutters the exact same color they already were, the constant harassment, the piling threats of lawsuits and the whispers in the neighborhood turned the absurd into something dangerous, because Abigail wasn't just abusing her influence, she was creating a paper trail, a case against me, fabricated yet frighteningly, official-looking, the kind of thing that could ruin a person's credit, property value, or even standing in the community. And it reached a breaking point when I came home one evening to find a notice taped to my door in bold, aggressive lettering. Final warning, continued noncompliance will result in legal action, and though my hands shook with anger as I read it, what chilled me to my core was not the threat itself, but the signature at the bottom. Abigail's, scrawled with a flourish like she had already declared herself president, judge, and executioner all in one, and as I stood there, that sinking, realization hit me like a punch in the gut. This wasn't a battle of petty neighbor versus homeowner anymore. This was war, and Abigail was willing to bend, twist, and break every boundary of decency, legality, and morality to win. And if I didn't act soon, she wouldn't just ruin my peace, she'd ruin my life. The breaking point came faster than I ever expected, and it unfolded like something straight out of a movie, the kind you can't believe is happening in real life. But there I was, standing in the middle of the packed HOA community hall, fluorescent, lights buzzing overhead, the smell of stale coffee and paper filling the air as the entire neighborhood gathered for what had been billed as a special meeting to discuss my alleged violations. A meeting orchestrated, of course, by Abigail, who strutted in wearing a bright neon blazer so loud it practically shouted for attention, her oversized earrings swinging like pendulums as she tossed her hair and made her way to the front of the room, her confidence radiating like she had already won. But what she didn't know, what no one in that room expected, was that I had been quietly preparing my own arsenal, because while Abigail had spent weeks fabricating fines and twisting bylaws to weaponize them against me, I had been consulting with an attorney, digging into HOA regulations, state housing laws, and even filing for records of board meetings under public disclosure rights. And I discovered not only the extent of her abuse of power, but also clear evidence of misconduct, financial irregularities, and personal overreach that could not just strip her of influence, but potentially get her sued. And as the meeting began, Abigail wasted no time unleashing her performance, waving a thick binder of violations in the air and dramatically reading off one offense after another in her shrill voice, pausing every few sentences to glance around the room, fishing for nods of approval. And I could see the tension building in the crowd, neighbors shifting uncomfortably in their seats, some whispering to one another, some rolling their eyes, but most too afraid to speak up, because Abigail's intimidation had worked on them for years. And as she finally slammed the binder shut with a smug smile and announced that the board would now vote on whether further legal action would be pursued against me, I rose from my seat, my heart pounding like a drum, my palms slick with sweat, but my resolve sharper than ever, and in that moment, every ounce of anger, frustration, and exhaustion I had endured transformed into laser focus. Because this was the moment I would turn the tables, and with the calmest voice I could muster, I began by thanking Abigail for her detailed report, a comment that made her smirk widen as she crossed her arms like a queen awaiting her crown. But then I reached into my bag and pulled out a stack of documents, photographs, timestamps, copies of emails she had sent me, letters she had forged under HOA letterhead without board approval, and most damning of all, bank statements showing unexplained expenditures from HOA funds that had been redirected under her advisory role into services provided by companies she herself owned. And as I laid each piece of evidence on the table in front of the stunned board members, the room fell silent except for the shuffle of papers, and Abigail's smirk began to falter, her posture stiffening, her face flushing red as whispers rippled through the crowd like wildfire, neighbors leaning forward, eyes widening, gasps echoing when I revealed that she had not only fabricated rules targeting me, but had also levied thousands in bogus fines against other residents over the years. Money that conveniently disappeared into administrative fees, and when one elderly neighbor in the back stood up, shaking with anger as she confirmed that she, too, had been forced to pay Abigail directly for nonsense violations, the tide of the room shifted instantly. People who had once sat in silence now raising their voices, demanding answers, questioning how they had allowed this woman to dictate their lives for so long. And as the noise grew louder, Abigail snapped, slamming her hands down on the table and shouting that everyone was lying, that she was the only one protecting the community from bad homeowners. But her voice cracked under the pressure, her authority crumbling as the board president, who had been quiet until now, finally spoke, his tone grave as he acknowledged that the documents I presented were real, that Abigail had acted outside her authority, and that the board would be launching a full investigation into her conduct effective immediately. And in that moment, The neon blazer that had once seemed like a badge of power now looked like a desperate costume, a spotlight exposing her corruption. For all to see, and as neighbors turned their backs on her, some shouting, some laughing in disbelief, Abigail's composure broke completely, her face contorting with rage as she screamed threats, calling everyone ungrateful, accusing me of orchestrating a conspiracy before storming out of the hall in a flurry of slamming doors and clattering heels, her final attempt at control dissolving into humiliation. And though my hands still trembled, though my heart still pounded from the confrontation, I felt an overwhelming surge of relief, of vindication, because in that single night, the tables had turned. The truth had been dragged into the light, and Abigail, once the untouchable tyrant of the neighborhood, had been publicly unmasked. And while I knew the fight wasn't completely over, that the legal fallout would still take time, one thing was certain. Her reign of intimidation had ended, and for the first time in months, I walked out of that hall under the cool night sky, breathing freely, knowing the community finally saw her for who she truly was. In the days and weeks that followed that unforgettable night in the community hall, the neighborhood seemed to breathe easier, like a dark storm had finally passed and sunlight was breaking through. Because with Abigail exposed and stripped of her false authority, people began stepping out of their homes with a new sense of freedom, chatting by their fences, planting flowers without worrying about surprise violation notices, kids laughing louder in the park without fear of Abigail, scolding them for disturbing the peace. And slowly the community began to heal from the years of intimidation she had imposed. But what truly struck me wasn't just Abigail's downfall, it was the way people's perception of me shifted, because for so long I had been painted as the troublemaker, the homeowner who resisted rules, the so-called problem, yet now, neighbors who once avoided eye contact stopped by to thank me, some even admitting they wished they had spoken up sooner, and while I didn't need their apologies, hearing their words reminded me of why I had fought so hard, not just for myself, but to show that one person refusing to bow down to abuse of power can change everything. And as the legal process unfolded, with Abigail facing both civil penalties and the likelihood of criminal charges for her misuse of HOA funds, she seemed to vanish from public life, her once loud wardrobe and piercing voice replaced by silence. And in that silence, the neighborhood found peace. But beyond the gossip and legal proceedings, what mattered most was the legacy of the fight, because the HOA board, embarrassed by their complicity, voted in reforms that gave homeowners more say, established transparency measures, and limited the unchecked authority of any one member, ensuring that no one could ever weaponize the HOA again the way Abigail had. And watching those changes be written into the bylaws gave me a quiet satisfaction, knowing that future families moving into our community would never have to face what I endured. And on a personal level, the impact was profound. Because where I once felt like an outsider in my own home, now I felt rooted, stronger, and respected, and even though part of me still carried the scars of Abigail's relentless harassment, the late nights filled with worry, the anger boiling in my chest each time I saw her neon silhouette strutting down the street, I also carried pride because I hadn't just survived, I had transformed the very system that tried to crush me. And when I stood by my fence one evening, watching the sun set over the houses, the air alive with the sound of neighbors talking and children playing, I realized the fight had not only freed me, it had brought the entire community closer, teaching all of us that silence in the face of bullying only feeds the bully. But courage, even if it comes from just one voice, can ripple outward until it changes everything. And that became the greatest takeaway of all, that no matter how intimidating someone seems, no matter how high their walls of control appear to be, truth has a way of breaking through. And when it does, the impact lasts far longer than the reign of fear ever could.